From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. You might be deep into your summer holiday, but Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, is still at her desk and feeling the cool incoming chill of autumn and her next budget.
We haven't even set the date for the budget yet, so please forgive me if I'm not going to speculate about what might happen at an event that we haven't...
But speculation has been rife. They won the election just over a year ago, partly on the promise of securenomics and growth.
We want to fight the election on the economy because that's the only way that we can actually make the progress that we need.
But a few expensive U-turns and tough decisions later, it looks like we might need more of both.
So we're back here again talking about tax rises.
Headline inflation rose to 3.6% on the latest data for June.
It'd be very hard to imagine raising £50 billion in tax without tackling one of the big taxes, income tax or VAT.
We're living through another summer of relentless speculation ahead of a likely October budget about what the Chancellor's going to do on spending, on taxes, and how to meet her fiscal rules.
The story today: why is Britain broke?
My name's Mehreen Khan. I'm the economics editor at The Times.
This should be a quiet time for you and other people who speculate on the economy and what the Chancellor's going to do with it, shouldn't it?
Speculate? Oh, I'm not a speculator.
Sorry.
Luke.
Analyser.
Well, August is traditionally a slow month, but it's become much more normal in the last few years that either there's a little financial panic, which is what we had in August last year, which wasn't about the UK, but involved the UK. And now we're just stuck in this perennial cycle of having fiscal events. And when we're not in the fiscal event, we're just talking about the next fiscal event and constantly speculating about what's going to happen in said next fiscal event. So the UK economics calendar has become relentless, I would say.
So how poorly, or maybe well, you might say, it is the British economy today as we sit here talking?
Well, it's definitely taken a step back from the start of the year, which ended up being way better than most people would have expected. So in the first 3 months of this year, the UK economy expanded at 0.7%. It was one of the best growth rates we've had in a couple of years. It meant that we were the fastest growing economy in the G7. And it felt like there was a glimmer in which, okay, 2025's got off to a very good start. Maybe we are finally turning that corner.
But
this week, on Thursday, we're going to get the second quarter official figures on the UK's economic growth. And I'm afraid to say it's probably going to show that the beginning of the year was a blip and we're back to basically no growth, very stagnant growth, something around 0.1 to 0.2% of GDP, which is the rut that we've been stuck in, I would say, since the post-pandemic period.
And inflation back on the rise as well.
Yeah, we also got the news very recently that inflation is going to hit 4% potentially in September, which is double the Bank of England's target rate. And those 4% numbers just sort of give me a lot of flashbacks to like 2022 and 2023, where we're just constantly seeing inflation going up. So, some people call it a doom loop. It's a bit reminiscent of so much of the years that we've been experiencing in terms of cost of living crisis, stagnant growth. The only difference seems to be that we have a new government, but they're facing exactly the same challenges.
And taking that doom loop or whatever it is and thinking about how we might feel that. If I'm one of Keir Starmer's siblings, who he said, sort of hardworking people who feel like they're not getting what they should at the moment, how do we experience what is happening at the moment?
So I think the cost of living issue, which had been ameliorated a little bit in the last year because people's real wages, which is their earnings when you strip out inflation, were actually growing. Now that inflation's back, we're going to be feeling it again in our pockets. And the reason I think the cost of living issue is important is because the areas where inflation is going up is the areas where people actually feel it the most, which is their energy bills and when they go shopping for food, which means, let's give me a very personal example. My oat milk now used to cost £1.80 is now already £2.20. It's stuck at that level. So if it goes up by a few percentage points more, I'm going to feel that a lot because it just shows to me that everything is going up. The other one I think that is worth mentioning is that Brits are really saving a lot of money now. Our savings rate is historically almost unprecedentedly high at 10%. Now, when Brits save, that means they're worried about the future. So there are all these little pockets about how we can measure how consumers are feeling, which just suggests that really nothing positive seems to have happened to the consumer mindset over the last couple of years, despite the election, despite the little summer of brief honeymoon that Labour seemed to enjoy for about 5 days.
And as you sip on your £1 million oat latte, do you blame Rachel Reeves for the cost of that? Should we blame Rachel Reeves for all of those things that you've laid out there?
Can I blame the food price increase on Rachel Reeves? Now, this is a question the Bank of England actually just asked itself a couple of days ago. They sort of came up with, yeah, maybe. So one of the issues is just commodity prices. As a country, we are exceptionally exposed to global changes in market prices for the stuffs that we import. Then there's the issue, and the one that we report about a lot, which is how the government's changes in tax policy, particularly on employers, is feeding into inflation. And the Bank of England made a, I think, reasonable assessment that because the national living wage has gone up, a lot of people who work in UK retail, for example, supermarkets, are subject to national living wage. Supermarkets are having higher wage bills. Those supermarkets are passing on that squeeze to their margins to consumers. So there is a partial sense in which government policy, we can say, is directly contributing to certain forms of inflation that we're going to experience for the rest of the year.
And also, we've seen quite a few U-turns in policy, just thinking about where resources are divvied up, the U-turn on welfare, on winter fuel payment. None of that is helping.
And I think that's much more important from a bigger reputational sense. So we're going to get on to how markets and investors feel about the UK. But there was, I think, a reasonable assessment when this government was elected with a reasonably historical mandate. Yes, it was probably shallow, but it was still big. We had a chance for a government that probably had a historical mandate to achieve lots of things, but they haven't shown the political bravery to go ahead with unpopular decisions. And that's why I think, we can talk about the merits of the welfare U-turn and winter fuel allowance and where the burden should fall. All of those things are up for debate. But the fact that once the decision was made and then reversed would suggest that Labour is not translating this historical mandate and not showing enough political bravery to do unpopular things. And that, I think, is one of the bigger things that's really adding to the sense that this government has become impotent so quickly.
And are we any kind of an outlier in this, or are we just broadly falling into the pack of what other Western or European nations are doing and feeling?
So on the macroeconomics, we're probably not really so much of an outlier. So there is very little growth across the European Union, for example, our closest partners. The US has always been an outlier because it's always been doing very well, despite what Donald Trump thinks. So let's take the US out of that picture. Inflation, I think, is becoming a bit of an outlier. So this 4% that I spoke about, inflation is probably going to fall below 2% in most European countries. There's scant evidence of inflation in the US economy, despite the fact that we think tariffs will raise US inflation. It just hasn't turned up yet. So on that measure of prices, the UK does look like an anomaly. But I think what we're really good at in this country is really, and I don't want to sound like Liz Truss with this, but we really have a cloud over us. And that cloud is about the government sort of being embattled, that's sort of the media being on the back of said government. We're really just quite bad at saying what we're good at. And I think the sense of declinism is actually much more important in shaping perceptions from the outside about what the UK has become, and also for us. Because, I look at France, right? It's a country which has a higher debt to GDP pile than us. Their budget deficit is bigger than ours. They have massive political problems and will probably be close to electing a very far-right president in a couple of years. But it doesn't attract as much gloom from anyone. So I think there are other issues about how we talk about ourselves which would make me think that we are just kind of uniquely miserable right now.
We're doomsters and gloomsters, as Boris Johnson once said. So thinking about what Rachel Reeves has in front of her, we'll get into exactly what the choices are and what the things are hemming her in. But just first of all, how big a moment would you say this upcoming budget in October or November, whenever it ends up to be, is actually going to be for her?
It feels like every budget has become the most significant budget since the last budget. But this one, there are a couple of factors because of everything we've just spoken about, like the fact that probably everything that could have gone wrong in the economy sort of a little bit has. So inflation is higher, interest rates are higher, there's trade uncertainty. Her fiscal headroom, which was negligible, is probably already been wiped out. And the big question now is about this question of political bravery. So 1 year in to a difficult fiscal inheritance, is Labour going to take pretty tough decisions and basically break some of the promises that it said it's had? It is one about political courage. And I think that's why this budget is a bit more important in terms of signalling than just sort of the fiddling around of which taxes are going to go up and which taxes are going to go down. This is finally, I think, a sense in which she could potentially break this reputation for caution and say, yes, you're not going to enjoy what we're about to do, maybe on tax rises or spending or even the fiscal rules, but I'm going to do it and I'm going to stick with it.
That was kind of the political argument they were making last year, saying we're going to do the pain now and then we're meant to already be in the sunlit uplands, but maybe we need to go through that again. So let's get into some of the rules that are hemming her in, some might say. The first two are her fiscal rules, the stability rule and a rule on debt. What are they?
The main one that we talk about when we talk about the fiscal rule is this idea of the stability rule. It's very simple. The government wants to cover all of its day-to-day spending, so things like the paper clips that you buy in the Ministry of Justice and civil servants' salaries, all this day-to-day stuff that you take to run a government, all of that money should be covered by incoming tax revenues by the end of the decade. Stability, so you just cover your costs with what you bring in. And that's
radical.
You probably just say pretty sensible. How hard could it be? It can be pretty hard.
Yeah.
That's the rule that we talk about. That's the most binding rule. It's the one that we can measure the most. And it's the one that when we talk about the fiscal headroom, what we're measuring against. So when we say her headroom is 10 billion, for example, that means the buffer that she has to hit this rule by 2029, 2030 is 10 billion.
And that's the one that the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, which also goes by
NISA,
not the supermarket, say is going to be missed by 40 billion plus.
Indeed. And if you take this, she's missing it by 40 and she had a buffer of 10. If she wants to have exactly the same kind of buffer, she needs to find 50 billion somewhere. I will just say with the caveat, NISA's estimate is much higher than a lot of other people's in the cities. They would say she's probably got somewhere between 20 to 30 billion to fill. But we're still in the tens of billions.
One of these other fiscal rules is about government debt. What is the rule that Rachel Reeves says she has to stick to?
Again, it's very simple that a certain measure of national debt, which the government has targeted, it's called public sector net liabilities, should be coming down by the end of the decade. This is a little variation of a theme that Jeremy Hunt had a debt rule like this, that debt should just be falling within a parliamentary period. They're all within the realms of being very sensible. I always find it an irony that when I talk to people in financial markets about the importance of the rules, they don't actually know what the rules are, but they're like, as long as they're getting hit and the OBR says they're getting hit and signalling's good, we'll buy it.
But isn't that a slight nonsense rule in that I could say, well, this year I'm going to borrow 50 trillion, but by the end of the parliament, I'm only going to borrow 2 trillion. And look, my debt is falling.
It's even a little bit even more cynical than that. So in the debt rule, it only has to fall between one year and the other year. So it only has to fall between 2028 and 2029.
So you can do
29 to 2030.
Loads of years of lots of borrowing.
You just need a little fall. The reality with the fiscal rules is that they're almost designed not to be met. You are forecasting so far out into the future that who knows what the future will hold. I went back and looked at my first ever fiscal event that I covered for the Times, which was March 2022, when Rishi Sunak was Chancellor. And he put out a whole series of forecasts which said that by this year, 2024-25, the budget deficit would be 1.2% of GDP, and the OBR said it would be 1.2% of GDP, and we all celebrated that it was going to be 1.2% of GDP. It was 5.6% of GDP, right? So in some senses, these are important signalling devices, and they're very important credibility and trust devices. And I mentioned trust. One person who didn't engender too much trust was Liz Truss, because she didn't have any fiscal rules. So they're very important in just sort of maintaining this bizarre sort of fiction that we all have, that we have governments that are responsible and understand they need to rein in the public finances.
One of the other things holding Rachel Reeves in is some of the promises they made on the election trail last year, beginning of last year, particularly on the taxes on working people, them including...
Well, who don't they include anymore? We don't know. It's a difficult definition. But the taxes, basically, we know the realm, the world of taxes, national insurance, VAT, income tax.
Yes, and national insurance, they've already done a slight breaking of that, some might say, by raising the amount of employer national insurance.
I mean, they basically broke the promise. I mean, we're being very generous to say that they didn't break the promise. The national insurance was increased on employers. That is de facto tax on working people. And these are the big tax revenue generators that the government has. They generate almost 3/4 of the government's tax revenues. So if you're ruling this out, this entire pot of 3 massive taxes, you're really just going to either have to find an entire whole new form of tax, or you need to tax the remaining quarter of the population or the economy or businesses. And there's a sense in which the government has squeezed that little portion as much as possible. There's another promise too. And that promise is basically the promise to raise investment in this country. So Labour spent a lot of time talking about how Tory austerity has been so damaging to our public services, so damaging to the long-term productive capacity of this economy, that they came in promising to raise investment finally to correct so many of those damaging years.
We want Biden-style money for bridges, roads, power stations.
Not even Biden style, just a normal European social democracy kind of stuff, just stuff that we should have been doing. Just having no real terms cuts in investment spending because it's been so awful. I mean, you talk about, schools having their ceilings falling in, all of these, local councils going bust. And Labour sensibly did campaign on saying that they didn't want to do this anymore. So we've got 3 promises. And if we go back to NISA, they devised, I think, a clever formulation, and they call this a Trillemma, which is that you cannot do all 3 of these things and achieve what you want to do. You have to break at least one.
Mehreen, we're talking about what might be going through Rachel Reeves' head as she chews her pencil in the Treasury as everyone else is out on lilos, splashing around in sun cream. You mentioned this Trillemma, which has been bandied around in the last few weeks or so. Can we go through which might be the easiest, I guess, or least politically damaging, perhaps? First of all, on the fiscal rules, you mentioned earlier that lots of people in the financial markets couldn't really even name some of the fiscal rules. I mean, would it be that damaging if she just said, actually, I'm going to rip this up for short-term expediency? That's
a very interesting question. I do think about this a lot. There is a slight drumbeat now of important people in the economics blob, including NISA, and even maybe the IMF, who are like, you know what, just change them a little bit. Just say situation's a bit difficult. We will meet the rule, but I have to kind of carve out some forms of spending, like maybe defense, because, the world's on fire, so you can't really count defense. It's borrowing. There's been a sense
and a lot of that can be capital investment.
Yeah, you can move different pots around. You can loosen the rules a little bit without causing a catastrophe in the financial markets of the Liz Truss sort of scale. I think that's probably correct. I think the only issue with that is that she probably can't do it in year 1 of government. So we're still kind of in year 1. I think probably halfway through a government parliamentary term, you could do it, because basically every chancellor we've ever had since the OBR was created in 2010 has made up some fiscal rules, broken the fiscal rules, and then made up some different types of fiscal rules. And it's never actually engendered a huge backlash from financial markets until Liz Truss. So when we're talking about why Rachel Reeves doesn't have the discretion that so many of her predecessors had, is because she's the first real permanent chancellor we've had in the post-Truss era. And when you speak to the Treasury and the Labour Party, they don't think they can play at all in any ways. They can't play around with the fiscal rules.
So you're advocating for, and I'm told Rachel's listening, writing all this down, tweak them to take out some areas of spending like defence, some big things which lots of the electorate wouldn't be too angry about going up.
And lots of the financial markets would just kind of understand. We haven't spent that much money on defence for the last 45 years. We are now going to have a target which is something like 3% of GDP. That money needs to come from somewhere. I think Gordon Brown, Rachel Reeves' sort of political hero and former chancellor, has also said, let's just think about excluding defence from the measure of national debt that's part of the fiscal rules. It's not going to be the end of the world, and everyone understands it's sensible because security and the defences of this country are important. I think she could do it. I just think they're just very squeamish about the fact that they've said that they're not Liz Truss and they're not going to fiddle around with them, and they're so determined to make the fiscal rules work that I don't see it happening at the autumn budget. I think it would be a reasonable thing to do, because you'd make, we're going to talk about all the people who could be angry from all the other promises that could be broken. I think the level of people that could be peed off by this is a bit smaller.
The other option is raising one of those taxes on working people, one of those big 3 taxes, national insurance contributions, VAT and income tax. NISA, again, who we've mentioned a lot, if they say that she's maybe got this 40 or 50 billion pound black hole, you're going to have to raise one of those taxes to fill that.
If the hole is as big as they say, then NISA also said you basically just need to hit income tax, because that's the part of the tax structure which just can generate huge amounts of money for you, and you can do that by either raising the rate that is paid by the wealthiest Britons on their income and a little bit on the basic rate, so the one that we all start paying at a certain threshold, and that can raise tens and billions of pounds. Now, when I said the number of people that could be angry about breaking the promises, this one's going to have the most angry people, right? Because millions, tens of millions of us, basically most working people pay some form of income tax. And that's why I think it's not going to happen. I don't think we're going to get such a flagrant breaking of the promise around not raising taxes on working people in a direct way. I think it's going to happen in an indirect way. It's going to happen in a stealth way, which is that rather than raising the actual rates that we pay, you freeze the income tax brackets, which has been happening since 2022. So, for example, lots of Brits for the last couple of years have been getting pretty healthy wage increases. So they're getting bumps of about 4 to 5% a year. But the income tax threshold are not adjusting in line with inflation. They've been stuck where they were before we had this incredible period of inflation, which means more of us are getting dragged into paying 40%, for example. Now, this is a massive revenue generator for the government. It was first announced by Rishi Sunak. It was supposed to expire in 2028, 2029. I think if Rachel Reeves wants to extend it another year, so the end of her forecast period, she could raise £10 billion, basically by doing nothing. But it's a stealth tax increase.
Because you just think, oh, well, my wages are going up and I've now slipped over into the higher rate or the additional rate. And, well, that's why my tax has gone up, not because, you're wondering why the threshold hasn't moved up with inflation.
Exactly, but the thresholds are supposed to move up with inflation. Yeah. That's how they work. That's the whole point.
We can't remember that time.
I think you're right. I think most people can't remember that this is how the system's supposed to work.
Yeah.
So it has kind of engendered some degree of docility where we just accept this, and I think the government will exploit that.
What about taxes not on working people? There are lots of ideas knocking around. Let's scrap the triple lock on pensions and how much they rise by each year. There's also the Gordon Brown idea of taxing gambling firms more often. Interesting or just too small?
No, interesting. And I think everything sort of adds up. So stealth tax rises in terms of income tax freeze thresholds is going to be big. You can get a number as big as 10 billion. Then we're probably going to see something around gambling. So sin taxes. I think
sin taxes?
Sin taxes,
nice.
Yeah. We've always kind of done it. So,
yeah.
I mean, it's always kind of gets a big cheer, a bit of a moral high ground sort of issue. So I think there could be something around gambling, a bit more on tax evasion, to say we're going to try and cut out people who are trying to evade the tax system, duties on cigarettes, alcohol, always classic Chancellor favourites that get you a couple of mil here and there. And then we can talk about what's massive, but it's probably not possible, but is also sort of entering the discourse. I think wealth taxes have entered the chat, basically.
But haven't they been slapped down? And this is where, say, you, Mehreen, are sitting on, you're earning £12.50 a week, but actually you're sitting on a £4 million house, and we should be taxing you maybe 2 or 3% a year on the value of that property.
So yeah, let's talk about wealth taxes, right? So why have they entered the chat? Because you're so fiscally hemmed in, as I said, and you don't want to touch so much of the 3/4 of tax pots that the government generates. So let's find new things to tax. And the left of the Labour Party, of course, are in favour of said, let's find new things to tax. And a constant one that comes up is wealth taxes. So you don't tax income, because we tax income so much in this country. Let's tax wealth. And often in this country, that's basically divided into 2 or 3 real things: property, pensions, and some form of financial or physical wealth. The reason it's so seductive is that in this country, I think total wealth, according to the ONS, is something in the region of £13 trillion. And it's basically concentrated among the richer parts of the population. So it's an inequality kind of measure if you want to go after it. And I've looked at some of the calculations. With a very modest wealth tax, let's say less than 0.5%, 0.25%. If you want to target on
so when I said 2 or 3%, actually way of the mark, way of the mark.
That's huge. You don't even need to do that much.
Yeah.
And if you're going to target a very small tax, a levy of about, say, 0.25%, and I'm getting these figures from Deutsche Bank, who put them out a couple of weeks ago, and you just want to target at the richest top decile, you can raise something between the areas of £7 to £8 billion, and that is just not to be sniffed at. Now, it sounds great, right? But it's just really complicated. And it, go back to the point of political bravery. This will require a lot of political courage for said government to say that they are implementing a wealth tax, which is going to scare all the people that have always been scared of Labour governments. It's going to raise all of those conversations about the non-doms are already leaving, all the rich folks are already leaving London and the UK, and we're going to have a wealth tax. And it's complicated because it's technical. Do you want to tax pensions wealth? The government already says we don't have enough pension savings in this country. Okay, let's do property. It's really hard to value it. Other countries that have experimented with wealth taxes, mainly in the continent, France, Germany and Sweden, have actually seen that people just adjust their behaviors, they leave, they shift their assets around. So it's I think it's worth just talking about it because it's complicated. And I will just go back to the point that yes, this government can do a wealth tax, but they really have to put their mind to it and say, yes, we're going to do it. And here's how we're going to do it. And here's how we're going to design it. And here's how we're going to stick to it, even if there are some unintended consequences from it. And right now, I just don't think Labour or Rachel Reeves are in that position.
And not fold like they did with winter fuel or clamp down on benefits, etc., etc. The other one is spend less.
Spend less, yes. That's basically the huge one. And that's been
There's too much cash sloshing around education and hospitals. Let's trim some of it, he said ironically.
That has been the tried and tested way in which we have tried to make fiscal rules work. We just stop spending. Now, this is a part, I think, of the three promises in which I think Labour would be most loath to renege on, because I think it is a big part of their political and economic identity that they want to correct for all of the failings of Tory austerity. However, I think the nature of events and how seductive it is to just sort of cut back on investment in future years because those future years are far away is probably going to be a bit too tempting.
And that's investment. That's not resident doctor salaries or teacher salaries. This is, are we building new roads and bridges and maybe even railway lines, the things that might feed through into greater growth?
All the green energy infrastructure, all the R&D that we wanted to do. Again, I'll go back to the Bank of England, which thinks that the government's fiscal tightening, which is due to come in already, is going to have a major impact on slowing economic growth. So there are costs to this. Just like there are costs to tax rises, there are costs to not doing the investment that you've promised to do. You basically get stuck in that low productivity, low growth trap that we've been in for nearly 20 years now. So none of this is free lunches. And I think I worry that investment is going to be the place where it's hit because that's just how it's always been done in the past.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm sensing from you throughout all of this a sense that what we're going to get when we get to the budget is tinkering, and what we need is something a bit more radical and un-British Treasury-like, if I could be so diplomatic.
Un-Treasury-like, for sure. I mean, I'm not a lobby journalist, and I sort of just see the politicians when I encounter them on thinking about political economy and generally how they sort of signal. I don't think, unless something changes and we come back in September after the recess and the Labour Party have their conference and they've decided to develop some cojones, that this fiscal event is going to be a true statement of political bravery about making tough choices and sticking to them and annoying people, but telling said people that in the long run this is good for you.
But you're saying that like it's as a political failing as opposed to this is what the stodgy Treasury always does.
There is Treasury brain rot. I mean, there is obviously just a natural inbuilt conservatism and caution that the Treasury has. But ultimately, if you are the Chancellor and the Prime Minister with this historical mandate that I've set out, you can browbeat them into doing exactly what you want. I think it has to come down to political choice. It has to come down to the sacrifices that you're willing to make and who you want to pee off. Now, I've probably just said that I think you can pee off the bond markets a little bit. I think the Treasury think that that's basically a non-starter. I think that they think that the shadow of Liz Truss still really hangs over them to such a degree that they're just not going to take any risks with that. But I think the costs of doing less investment spending and raising taxes on a population that already feels battered by tax rises and the fact they get nothing back for paying more tax is ultimately going to be the most politically poisonous thing that this government could do going into 2026 when we'll get council elections and we will have looked back between the period of 2024 and 2025 and say, why did we not make the most of the fact that we could do a lot of things early on in a term? That's why I think in terms of the Trillemma, I'm sort of with NISA and sort of the IMF, I'm just like, look, you have discretion to change the rules. Just change the rules.
And finally, thinking about household budgets. If you're counting pennies, you're worried about costs and the amount that's coming out of your pay packet each month, should people expect to feel poorer on the other side of this budget?
They won't feel much better, I don't think. And I'm going to come back to the fact that there is another scary inflationary bogeyman that's going to beset people in the rest of 2025. And I remember talking about inflation in 2024 when we had so many elections across so much of the developed world. And we spoke about inflation as the issue. that people felt betrayed by their governments because they had lived through this brutal period of price increases and they kicked out most of their incumbent governments. If the UK is stuck in a moment where inflation is, especially in food and energy prices, is just not going away, I think you introduce a whole new world of political pain that effectively Rachel Reeves has not been expecting, because every forecast and every Treasury outlook and every OBR modelling has just said that this inflation problem is supposed to go away and interest rates are supposed to come down. If they don't, then we have just piled on another huge factor of pain onto households that the government will feel it has limited ability to correct for. And that's tough.
Well, on that note,
Can I say, I need to say something positive.
Mehreen, no, you don't. That's fine. Mehreen, thanks very much.
Cricket was good.
Cricket was good. The weather's going to improve, I hear.
Oh,
yeah.
good. Excellent.
Yeah.
Premier League starting in a bit.
Thanks very much. Mehreen Khan, economics editor at The Times. You can read more of Mehreen Khan's work at thetimes.com if you've got a subscription, or in print as well. You can contact us, of course, anytime as well. thestory@thetimes.com is our email. That is it from us. The executive producer was Ed Drummond, and sound design and theme composition was by Mauro Seto. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.